A pen touches paper in a boardroom that no longer exists. The year is 1998. The company signing away its future is not thinking about the future. It is thinking about survival. Marvel Entertainment is bankrupt, or close enough to it that the distinction barely matters. And bankrupt companies do not negotiate from strength. They negotiate from fear. So when Sony offers to buy the film rights to a character nobody yet believes will matter, a teenager who shoots webs from his wrists, Marvel says yes, for a number that decades later will sound almost comedic. Most people believe this is where the story ends. A sale, a transaction. One company owns Spider-Man now, the other one doesn't. That's not what happened. Buried inside that contract is a clause that almost nobody outside the legal teams ever reads. Marvel didn't sell everything. It sold the films. It kept something else, something quieter, something that wouldn't matter for years, something that looked, at the time, like a technicality. Merchandising. Every toy, every backpack, every action figure on every shelf in every country forever, tied to global licensing rights that never left Marvel's hands. At the time, this seemed like keeping the crumbs while giving away the cake. Nobody in that room could have known they were about to watch the crumbs outgrow the cake. 11 years later, in 2009, Disney buys Marvel for $4 billion. The headlines focus on the characters: Iron Man, Captain America, the gods and soldiers and monsters that would soon fill a decade of box office records. What the headlines don't focus on is smaller and stranger. Disney didn't just buy characters. It bought clauses, fragments of old contracts written by executives who are no longer employed, for a company that no longer exists in its original form. One of those fragments has Spider-Man's name on it. Disney now owns something it cannot use, the merchandising rights to a character it cannot put in a movie, a hand without an arm, a key without a door. This is the moment the story stops being about a comic book character and starts being about something colder, about how ownership, once fragmented, doesn't disappear. It waits. Most people believe corporate deals are made in single, clean moments: a signature, a handshake, a press release. That's not how power actually moves. Power moves in increments so small they don't register as events. A clause here, a percentage there, a right retained just in case, filed away in language dense enough that almost no one will ever read it twice. By 2015, two studios that technically compete are quietly negotiating something unusual. Sony still owns the films. Disney's Marvel Studios wants Spider-Man inside the Avengers universe, not because it needs the money, but because it needs the myth. A cinematic universe without its most iconic character is a universe with a hole in its center. So they strike a deal. Marvel Studios will help produce the new Spider-Man films. Kevin Feige, the architect behind the entire MCU, will guide the character's story. Sony keeps the box office revenue. Disney takes a modest cut, reportedly in the range of a few percentage points. On paper, this looks generous. Sony gets access to the most valuable storytelling machine in modern entertainment, virtually for free. What almost no one calculates in that moment is what happens to merchandising when a character who once lived in isolated Spider-Man films suddenly stands next to Iron Man, next to Thor, next to Captain America, inside the most successful marketing ecosystem ever built. Here is the part that rarely gets said out loud. Every time Spider-Man appears in an Avengers film, the toy shelves don't distinguish. A child doesn't know which studio financed which frame. A child sees Spider-Man standing next to the Hulk, and that image alone sells a lunchbox, a costume, a backpack, a video game bundle. And the merchandising clause written in 1998, the crumbs Marvel kept almost as an afterthought, quietly activates. Every unit sold funnels back through licensing rights Disney inherited, not because Disney wrote a single frame of dialogue for those films, but because a lawyer decades earlier, in a company on the verge of collapse, decided not to give everything away. This is the loophole. Not a scandal, not a scheme, a structural inevitability, written into existence long before anyone involved could have predicted its scale. Some analysts estimate the combined value generated for Disney through this merchandising mechanism, across a decade of MCU integration, approaches $14 billion. The number is difficult to verify with precision. Entertainment conglomerates rarely disclose internal licensing rights with the kind of transparency that would outsiders confirm it exactly. But the scale of the claim itself reveals something more important than the number. It reveals that ownership, once fragmented, never truly reunites. It just waits for the right context to start extracting value again. By 2019, tension breaks the surface. Sony and Disney enter renegotiation. Reports suggest Disney requested a larger share of box office profits, closer to 50%, reflecting Marvel Studios' creative contribution to the character's resurgence. Sony declines. For a brief, disorienting period, headlines announce that Spider-Man is leaving the Marvel Cinematic Universe entirely. Millions of people feel something oddly personal about this. A fictional teenager, created 6 decades ago, becomes the center of public grief usually reserved for real departures. Petitions circulate, statements are issued. The internet performs a kind of ritual mourning for a character who legally was never fully anyone's to lose. And this is where something uncomfortable surfaces beneath the noise. The audience assumed they were watching a story about characters and universes. They were actually watching 2 multinational corporations negotiate the future cash flow of a fictional identity and feeling real anguish over the outcome. Fiction had become collateral in a spreadsheet dispute, and no one in the audience could tell the difference. A new agreement is eventually reached. Spider-Man returns to the MCU. The films continue. The toys keep selling. The merchandising clause keeps quietly working in the background, the way it always has. Indifferent to headlines, indifferent to public relief. But something has already been exposed, whether anyone chooses to look at it directly or not. A contract written in 1998, by people negotiating out of desperation, for a character no one yet took seriously, is still shaping billions of dollars in value more than 2 decades later, long after every original signature has moved on, retired, or been forgotten. The contract outlived its author's intentions. It outlived its company. It nearly outlived their industry's understanding of what a film right even meant compared to a merchandising right. And it is still running, silently, in the background. Every time a child unwraps a toy on a birthday morning, a fragment of that decades-old clause activates, without anyone in that room ever knowing it exists. There is a version of this story that ends with a simple lesson about corporate greed. That version is comforting because it assigns blame cleanly. But the more unsettling version is quieter than that. No one in 1998 was being greedy. No one was plotting a $14 billion advantage decades into the future. They were simply protecting what little leverage they had left in a moment of institutional collapse, using the only tool available to a desperate company: language. Precise, technical, forgettable language. And that is the part that lingers longest. Not that Disney won, not that Sony lost, but that the outcome of a multi-billion-dollar power structure was determined in large part by wording chosen under duress, by people who could not have imagined the world their sentences would eventually govern. We assume the future is shaped by decisions, bold ones, visible ones. But somewhere behind almost every empire, there is a quieter mechanism, a clause, a technicality, a right nobody thought mattered at the time, sitting dormant, waiting for a future large enough to activate it. And the strangest part isn't that Disney found that mechanism. It's that it was there all along, in plain sight, in a contract anyone could have read, and almost no one did, until it had already finished shaping the world it was written into.